Chronologically, we move forward to the next book, Exodus. Now, Genesis ends with Joseph and the story of how he went into Egypt. God gave him these dreams, and he became second man next to Pharaoh. All the nations had famine. They came to Egypt to buy bread. They became slaves. They ran out of food, and Egypt became the world power. And then the book ends. And then we go to the birth of Moses in Exodus. But between Joseph and Moses are over 400 years. So you flick the page, it's just a page. But in human history, that's a 400-year flick. So if you think, gee, there's something going on for 400 years, I don't know what was going on, you're right, you don't. And there's places in the Bible where there are these huge chunks of time and we don't know what's going on. From the Old Testament to the New Testament, 400 years. Another chunk, what went on? You have to read other histories to get that data. But the Bible's quiet. Pretty much quiet about what happened between Joseph and Moses. Pretty much quiet about what happened between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New. The book of Genesis is about origins. The book of Exodus is about redemption. How God took the children of Israel. They went in under Joseph 70 strong. By the time we're in Exodus, they're already over 1 million. There are millions of them. 400 years, you can have lots of babies. Grow exponentially, and they did. So Moses gets them out of there, the plagues, the Passover story. He redeems them from Egypt. Second book of the Bible, Exodus. Let's get our next click. Numbers. The children of Israel left Egypt under Moses. But on their way to the promised land, they lost faith. They lost heart. And they refused to go into the promised land that God promised them. That's why it's called the promised land. Oh, no, there's giants there. The cities are fortified. We're militarily outnumbered. We can't go in there. Now, they're saying this. These very people just saw the plagues happen in Egypt. They just walked through the Red Sea. They saw God turn the Nile River to blood. They're going to say, but God, you can't handle this. What were they thinking? So God says, fine. You don't want to go in there? You can't go in there. I'm going to give the nation to your children instead of you. See, what they said is, if we go in there, they'll kill all our kids. So God said, the kids you said are going to get killed, they're the ones who are going to go in there. You turn around and walk through the desert for 40 years. I'm going to let you all die off. And I'll let your children go in there. And they said, no, we'll go. And God said, don't go. No, we'll go. I said, don't go. No, we'll go. So they went. And they lost the war. They wandered through the desert with their tail between their legs for 40 years, rejecting Moses, rebelling against God. By the way, this gives you cause to think that the Jewish people are stiff-necked and stubborn. They are, almost as much as other people. My point is, the Bible is an equal opportunity offender. If the Bible says something bad about Jews, just wait a minute, it'll say something bad about you too. If the Bible says something good about Jews, just wait a minute, it'll turn around and say something good about you too. So just because we're talking about the Jews right now, don't think that they're any worse than any other people. God raised them up because everybody else was messed up. And they weren't able to do good either. Faithlessness. So we go from Genesis, where Joseph is introduced at the tail end of the story. His descendants in Exodus, taken out of Egypt where Joseph brought them in, but they weren't willing to go into the promised land, so they had to walk around in the wilderness for 40 years. That's what Numbers is about. Let's get our next click. Joshua. After the 40 years, Moses dies, so his partner, his commander of his forces, became Moses' replacement. Joshua was a mighty man of God, a good man and a warrior, a good guy, and a man of faith. And he led the children of Israel into the promised land. He divides it up, says your tribe gets this area, your tribe gets this area. Famous stories in there, like the story of the Battle of Jericho and the story of the sun standing still. This all happened under the ministry of Joshua. So Joshua takes them into the promised land, and next book. They're in there for about a generation, until the generation that saw all the great and wonderful things God did died off. And then everybody became like, well, we never saw those things happen. How do we really know God is real? And how did And they started turning their backs on God. And they did, according to the Scriptures, every man did what was right in his own eyes. They forsook the Scriptures and started serving other gods and doing weird and bizarre things. So, God would let their enemies take over. God told them, if you follow me, I'll bless you and I'll protect you. But if you don't, I'm going to let your enemies have their way with you. And so the enemies came in, took over, and oppressed them. And when they got oppressed, they cried out to God and said, we're sorry, we messed up, please forgive us, please deliver us. And God would raise up a deliverer. The deliverer was called a judge. And that's why the book is called the Book of Judges. Because not only were they military leaders, but they were also civil leaders. They led the nation, kind of like a king for a season. They're called judges, rulers. Well, the judge would deliver the people through mighty works. Gideon, Samson, these were judges. But when the judge died, after a few years, the people would go back into sin again. And so God would let their enemies have their way, and they would oppress them. And then they would cry out to God, and God would send them a judge. This is the sin cycle in the book of Judges, and the book of Judges lasts 400 or 500 years of this sin cycle going over and over and over again. That's the book of Judges. Next book. 1 Samuel, and let me see my next click, 2 Samuel, they go together. The children of Israel figured, we're having all these problems with the other nations, not because we're sinning and turning our back on God, but because we don't have a king. If we only had a king, everything would be good again. Isn't that like us? We always think the problem isn't what the problem is, If I only had more money, all my problems would go away. No, it wouldn't. Gee, if I only had that girl instead of this girl, all my problems would go away. If I only never moved into this house, all my problems would always go away. There's always something. But since you're there with that money, and you're there with that girl, and you're there with that house, I think I know what the problem is. It's me. I'm the problem. I got to straighten out. Children of Israel were doing the same thing we do. They're saying, the problem is not us. We're great and wonderful. The problem is we don't have a king. If you'd only give us a king, we'd be fine. God says, you guys, you want a king? Fine, I'll give you a king. So he picked a great man, a man named Saul. Saul was a good man, but the power went to his head, and he became a bad man. And as soon as he became a bad man, he picked another man to replace him, David. David was also a good man, but the power never went to his head. So 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is about the life of the first and second king of Israel. And then we get into all the kings of Israel, and those are the next two boxes. Let's take a look. 1 Kings and 2 Kings. You can really see 1 Samuel through 2 Kings is just the story of the kingdom of Israel, and it lasts several hundred years. Now, if you look at the timeline, 2000 BC was Abraham, 1500 Moses, so that put us in Egypt. We took off 500 years, that gave us King David, the first king, at 1000 BC. We take off 500 years, there's the destruction of Judah. So we know that the kingdoms lasted about 500 years, so 1 Samuel to 2 Kings is about 500 years. It's a real easy way to understand it. Well, after flipping over with the kings, God said, enough's enough. You guys, you keep turning your back on me, you keep worshiping idols, I'm done. You're getting punished. Israel was destroyed. About 100 and some odd years later, Judah followed suit. And there was a gap, 70 years of exile. And that's why that gap is there. They went to Babylon for 70 years as their punishment for turning their back on God and not following his law. But he promised them they'd come back. And sure enough, after 70 years, they did. Next box. Ezra, and the next box, Nehemiah. Under the ministries of Ezra and Nehemiah, they brought the people back. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple and tried to get the people back walking with God and following the law again. That's the entire Old Testament. That's the whole history. You just heard it in a few minutes, and it only takes those 11 books to understand it. All the other books of the Bible are plugged in additional information about one of those time periods. So let's go back to the beginning, back to Genesis, and start filling in the blanks. Right under Genesis, you see Job. When you read the book of Job, by the way, it's very poetic, so it's hard to understand portions of it. It's very lengthy, but it's an awesome book. Job shows us that we can love God, walk with God, still suffer. And our suffering doesn't mean God has abandoned us, and it definitely doesn't mean we should abandon God. That's what Job's about. And when people try to put a date on Job, when was Job written? Well, the nations mentioned in Job, we don't have any secular history on, so it's very old. And if you look at the lifespan of Job himself, back in those days, they lived much longer than we do today. And Job lived, I don't know, a few hundred years. So we figure, okay, if he lived that long, he was before the days of Genesis, before Genesis ended, when people had long lifestyles. Somewhere before Noah, maybe, they say, or maybe right after. So that's why Job is put in at Genesis.